Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode is a rebroadcast of a 2010 episode called So You Want to Work Abroad. And before I get into that, I just want to thank everyone who has responded to my request for transcribing episodes. And I want to give a big shout out to somebody who generously transcribed episode 91. That's the one with Carol Tassone talking about shared trauma. Rashida Edwards, LMSW. She's a couples therapist at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy in New York City. So Rashida, thank you so much. Now, as I was saying, back in 2010, I spoke with a guy who recruited licensed social workers from outside of the UK who wanted to live and do social work in the UK. Now, over the years, I've gotten lots of emails from social workers who listened to the episode and wanted to know more about how they could hop the pond and get a job in Britain. My brief response was, I have no idea. Please contact the recruiting company. Now, in December of 2016, I was contacted, not by a social worker, but by a British recruiter by the name of Kai Searle, who works for Amicus Recruit. Here's what his email said, and I'm going to do my best British accent, not because I know what he sounds like, but because I'm reading Harry Potter with my daughter, and we're really getting into all the voices. Okay, pretend I'm Kai. Morning, Jonathan. Thanks for getting back to me. I'm currently working with a British authority that have a huge recruitment drive at the moment for overseas social workers to work in southeast England, particularly social workers based over in the United States, Canada, South Africa, and Australia. We're looking ideally for social workers with at least 2 years post-qualified experience. And, by the way, qualified is sort of what we talk about as being licensed here in the United States. Anyway, so ideally for social workers with at least 2 years post-qualified experience in working with vulnerable children, ideally with a child protection team or setting. Now, the minimum contract length would be typically around 12 to 24 months, but it could be permanent. The start date is January or February of 2017, and their relocation costs, flight, accommodation, rent, sponsorship visa would all be covered with a fantastic relocation package. I hope you had an excellent weekend. Best regards, Kai. Seems like a nice guy, right? And yes, he did write, fantastic relocation package. Now, before I shared this seemingly fantastic opportunity with you, I did some checking around. I looked at Kai's company, Amicus Recruit, and it seemed legit. But then again, we're in the era of fake news, and, well, because the internet, I asked my friend David Niven, who's the former head of the British Association of Social Workers and host of the Social World podcast, what he thought. And he said they were legit. So, this seems like a legit offer. If you're a licensed social worker with experience in child protective services and want to do some social work in Southeast England, email Kai, that's Kai, at amicusrecruit.com. Now, of course, this information is on the website, socialworkpodcast.com, on the Twitter feed at SOCWORK podcast, and the Facebook page, facebook.com/SW podcast. And if you have no interest in working in the UK, but know someone who does, please share this episode with them. And after listening to this episode, if you're interested in learning more about the differences between social work in the USA and the UK, check out the conversation I had with David Niven in episode 6 of the Social World podcast. And that link is also on the website and really wherever you find information on the internet these days. Now, 2 more things about this episode. First, you'll hear my original introduction. And second, the person I'm talking to is David Dininio, not Kai Searle. Now, Kai did listen to the episode, and he said, "Excellent episode." So I assume that means that the information David shared still applies. And if you end up contacting Kai, and he's still talking to you after my horrendous British accent, please post a comment on the episode page of the Social Work Podcast and tell us about your experience. And now, without further ado, on to a rebroadcast of episode 58 of the Social Work Podcast. So You Want to Work Abroad, an interview with David Dininio.
So let's be honest. You didn't become a social worker because you wanted to travel the world. Even if you're somebody that's got the travel bug, you're a social worker. You're not making a whole lot of money. How are you going to finance it? Well, today's podcast is on how social workers can work abroad. Now, I'm a big proponent of living abroad. When I was 15, my family moved to Cambridge, England. And I got to be honest, I was not interested in going. I was supposed to start 10th grade at T.C. Williams High School in Alexandria, Virginia. You might have heard of T.C. Williams. Denzel Washington made it famous in the movie Remember the Titans. It was a story about how a coach and a football team helped the school and the city come to terms with racial integration. Now, the movie came out years after I graduated, and honestly, it was the first I'd heard of that story. But back when I was 15, I don't think knowing the history of my high school would have made too much of a difference. I just knew that TC was going to be a great place to spend 10th grade. What could I possibly learn by moving to England for a year that I couldn't get by hanging out with my friends in Alexandria? Well, as it turns out, a lot. I learned that I loved chicken tikka masala and mango lassis. I learned that Eddie Murphy was the funniest guy in America only because Americans couldn't understand a word of what Scottish comedian Billy Connolly was talking about. I learned that some McDonald's in England charged for ketchup, a practice, by the way, that I self-righteously denounced in the name of all that was good about America. And speaking of America, one of the oddest things was that living in England made me feel, I think probably for the first time in my life, like I was an American. I found myself defending my country, explaining our tripartite form of government, explaining that not everyone looked, talked, or lived like J.R. Ewing from the TV show Dallas. I learned that just because I spoke English didn't mean that I knew anything about the English. I learned that Disney totally misled me when they said, "It's a small world after all." The kids that I went to school with that year in England had a totally different set of values, social norms, career aspirations, career opportunities, sense of fashion, and I was totally surprised by this. Why? Well, because I believed that it was a small world after all. And I was wrong. My year in England taught me that my world was small. The world was very, very large. In addition to the realizations I had about myself and others, I also got to travel, which, as you'll hear in this interview, is one of the real benefits of working abroad as a social worker. That year, I looked for sea monsters in Scotland's Loch Ness. I went skiing in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia. I ate tapas in Spain. That's years before they became overpriced and hip in the United States. I sipped sweet mint tea in Morocco, and I ate wild boar in the French Alps on New Year's Eve. And all of this sounds very exotic, but one of the other things I learned about living in England is that it's not really that far to go to France. Spain is just a boat ride. When you grow up in the United States, your sense of distance is totally different. I mean, it can take 24 hours to drive from one end of Texas to the other, and it can take you 18 hours to drive from one end of Great Britain to the other. So after a year of mind-blowing experiences, I came home to Alexandria to find out that my friends had also had a year of mind-blowing experiences. Just that their year of mind-blowing experiences all happened together. And it took me months to catch up to all the inside jokes, all the games, all of the TV shows, the cultural references, the things that I missed. And to be honest, it took a little while for me to really appreciate how influential my year in England had been. And one of the things that I talk with David Dininio about is whether or not going abroad as a social worker is actually going to help a social worker's career. And he argues pretty convincingly that, in fact, taking a year and learning another social service system will absolutely benefit a social worker's career. So if you're interested in learning more about what working abroad means, if you're really interested in traveling to, say, the UK or Australia, if you have questions about how do I finance it? Can I bring my cat? Do I need a license? Do I have to be a community organizer? Do I have to be a policy person? Can I do direct practice? This podcast's for you. All of these questions are going to be answered. In today's Social Work Podcast, I speak with David Dininio. He's a recruitment manager for HCL Social Care International. And David and his team of consultants are responsible for collaborating with U.S. and Canadian social workers to help them achieve their dream of working abroad in the United Kingdom and Australia. One note about today's interview. I thought that it's fitting that for this podcast on American social workers working internationally, that I would interview someone outside of the United States. David works and lives in Toronto, Canada, and I was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We used Skype to record the interview. And so without further ado, on to episode 58 of the Social Work Podcast. So you want to work abroad, an interview with David Dininio. David, thanks so much for being here on the podcast and talking with us today about international social work. My first question for you is there a difference between social work in the United States or Canada and another country, say the United Kingdom?
Not really. Fundamentally, social work is the practice itself is constant across the world. Within different countries, they have different structures, different methodologies, but in general, it's just helping people deal with problems in their lives. Some countries obviously have a greater demand, whether it be working in, for example, Haiti right now, or going to countries like the United Kingdom or the United States or Canada, where it's a little more structured, but the demand is still there for social workers.
So what types of jobs do social workers do overseas? Like, for example, if I have an MSW and I do therapy in the United States, can I do therapy in the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. When it comes to, comparing North America in general compared to, say, the UK or Australia or South Africa or New Zealand, the job roles are essentially the same. Whether you're doing, child protection work or dealing with adult mental health, you're still working at service agencies or with local government, school boards, correctional institutions. It's just the intensity might change a little bit. In the UK, for example, it is by far the longest standing social work system in the world. And, with a very large population, the demand on the social worker is a little more intense than, say, for example, in Canada. But the job they do as a social worker remains the same underneath the policies and acts of the various countries.
So would I need an MSW to go overseas, or could I have a bachelor's in social work? Is there any sort of minimum educational requirements?
Yeah, typically the minimum educational requirement is a bachelor's of social work. So anyone that has a BSW or an MSW has the ability to work overseas, again, in the UK, for example, where employers do require a minimum of a BSW for a social worker to be employed as a social worker legally, for that matter.
So let's say I have my BSW or MSW and I'm interested in going overseas. What would I actually have to do to get overseas? Like, what's the process? Is there paperwork and visas and all that stuff?
Well, each country has different requirements to work as a social worker in their country. For example, in the United Kingdom, you have to be registered as a social worker with the country's governing body called the GSCC. In order to register as a social worker in the UK, you do have to have either a BSW or an MSW. In Australia, it's a little bit different. For example, you don't necessarily have to be registered with the association in that country, but again, a BSW is the minimum educational requirement needed to work as a social worker there. Now, that being said, if someone does have a diploma in social work, they can still work in the social care field in different countries, just maybe not at the level of a degreed social worker.
So let's say I graduate and I've got my degree. How do I actually get registered in the UK, for example?
Well, for example, in the UK, once you have your degree, you can actually download an application from the association or from the council online. It's about a 28-page application that's very detailed. It does require you to provide proof of your graduation and your degree, including transcripts, as well as work experience and references. Well, once that's completed, it is then sent to the governing council with an application fee. And then from there, they go ahead and do all the background checks and processing. Once they see everything checks out on their end, then they actually include you as part of the register in the UK.
Wow. So as as somebody from the United States, I could graduate, fill out this really long application, and then be registered to provide social work services in the UK?
Absolutely. And that registration is initially it's good for 3 years, and then it's a yearly fee after that to keep registered. Now, as part of the GSCC, they do require for you to keep up certain levels of professional development, attend a certain number of hours in training and work in order to stay registered.
So obviously I would get my passport and, I was registered. I get my passport. Do I have to have an agency that has said, yes, we'll hire you before I can actually go over? Or can I just, get on a plane and head over to the UK and say, need a social worker?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of different options available. If one of the things that we suggest to most social workers who want to work internationally, especially, for example, in the UK, is to dig into your family backgrounds, find out if you have family dating back to, say, parents or grandparents that are born in that country. For example, again, in the UK, if you have grandparents that are of British citizenship, then you are eligible to get a UK ancestry visa. Which essentially is almost like a British passport. It allows you to go in and out of the country and work for any employer that you wish to. If you have European descendants, you may be eligible for an EU passport, which allows you to travel, throughout the European Union very freely. If you don't have either one of these, then you would actually have to get a work permit or a visa. Again, every country has, their own structure. As far as visas are concerned, their own prerequisites and criteria. Again, because we deal with the UK so much, the UK has a multi-tiered immigration system. Underneath that immigration system, there's a variety of different work visas that are available to, say, North American social workers to be able to go over and work overseas in the UK.
And so I can get one of those visas without having, a job in hand?
For a couple of them, yes. For example, there is what they call a Tier 1 or highly skilled workers visa that you can apply for. It's a visa that you essentially own, and it gives you the freedom, the independence, and autonomy to be able to work for any employer overseas in the UK. So you can, again, go over to the UK with this visa, pick out an employer you want to work for, whether it be contract or permanent, and you don't need to be sponsored by an employer. There's another visa called a Tier 2 visa or a skilled workers visa that does require sponsorship and requires an employer to present you with an offer of employment before you can actually apply for the visa. For other countries, for example, in Canada, for anyone under the age of 30 years old, there's a third visa available called the Youth Mobility Visa, typically available only to Commonwealth countries, where if you're under 30 years of age and you hold a degree, you can get this visa as well without sponsorship from an employer.
So it really depends on what your situation is. I mean, if you have like 25 years of clinical experience and, you're the director of a social service agency and, you might be eligible for one of those highly skilled visas.
Absolutely.
Which would be different than, I'm 25, I just graduated with my MSW and I'd love to spend a year in England.
That's right, exactly. There's a lot of options available. Again, the visas are dependent, Some are based on a point system where you're given points for your education, your work experience, as well as your financial status. To be able to go over to the UK on a work visa, you have to have a certain amount of financial stability, we'll say, before you can actually apply to go over there.
Yeah, when you say financial stability, do you mean that you have to actually talk about what's in your bank accounts?
Absolutely. The one thing that the UK government is trying to avoid is people coming over to the country and jumping on the social assistance system right away. So what they've done is part of the work permits that are available to international social workers, one of the criteria is you have to have a certain amount of financial funds in your bank account prior to actually applying for your visa. And then when you do apply for your visa, you have to provide bank statements as proof that you have that money in the bank to support yourself when you go over to the UK. It's almost considered like bridging money, if you will, or support money from the time you land until your first paycheck.
It sounds like it costs some money to work overseas, to work internationally. Is that true? And if so, how much does it cost? And are there ever things like relocation funds?
Yes, it does cost money. The first cost would be, for some countries, again, like the UK, is paying an application fee to be registered as a social worker in that country. The second thing would be an application fee for your work permit or your visa. Again, they vary depending on which visa you're applying for, as well as having, again, as I mentioned, the funds in your bank in order to apply. And then additionally, there's, you have to be financially ready for picking up accommodations when you're overseas, paying for your groceries, your flight, a cell phone, other necessities that you'll require once you hit the ground. There's really no definitive amount of money or definitive cost involved in international social work. We cannot say that, it's going to cost you $5,000 to go overseas and work in the UK. The cost varies depending on the type of visa you want, the type of accommodation you want, whether it be a shared apartment or a one-bedroom, or you might even be staying in a hostel, short-term, long-term accommodation, as well as your flights. So it varies depending on the person and what they want and what they require.
So it sounds like it would be unlikely that most social workers would get relocation funds or get financial assistance from a job to move over there to do work.
Oh, no, absolutely. There's a lot of employers that are willing to offer relocation packages or relocation bonuses to international social workers. In fact, I was just speaking with a social worker out of Chicago just the other day who received a job offer from one of the councils in the UK, and they offered her a very nice relocation package to help pay for her flight and accommodations. They actually put her up in a hotel for 2 weeks until she could find her own apartment. They gave her money for moving expenses. Now, a lot of the relocation packages are reimbursement, so you'd still have to be paying money up front for accommodation and flights. However, after a certain amount of time working with the employer, they would actually reimburse you back that money.
And what types of jobs would those be? Would those be sort of direct service in the field jobs, or is that more the administrative types of positions? Yeah,
it'd be direct in the field. The majority of the positions that we deal with are frontline social worker, case manager positions. The social work industry is essentially broken down into 3 or 4 categories, one being children and family services, the second being adult mental health services, elderly care and management or gerontology, and then the fourth could be considered adoption and fostering. Anyways, that's how it's broken down in the UK. But by far, the majority of roles that we deal with are frontline case managers and social workers. But as far as relocation, I mean, that's available it's really dependent on the employer. If they want to offer relocation for an administrative position, then that's fine. But for the social work positions that we deal with, there are a good number of employers that are willing to help international social workers out with costs.
So how much would employers pay? And I know that's probably there's probably a wide range as there is in any job, but what are pay scales like in places like the UK or Canada or any of the other countries where you place folks?
Absolutely. Well, again, I'll use the UK as an example. To come into the UK as an international social worker, you start off pretty much at ground level, whether you have, 5 or 10 years of experience. Not that you're going to come in as newly qualified, but you cannot expect to come into the country at the level you're at, say, in the US or Canada, because you're not familiar with the legislation, with the structures, the methodologies, the theories in the UK. So you're going to be required to get into a lower position in order to pick up that knowledge. And then as you gain more experience in the UK, you can start working your way up. If you're coming into the UK as, a baseline social worker, say with, a year to 3 years of experience, you could earn anywhere from 18 to, 21 pounds per hour. And with the exchange rate at I think it's about $1.65 or $1.67 right now, that translates into a pretty good hourly rate. And then as you go higher, that rate obviously increases. Typically, the UK is known for paying higher salaries than North America.
So let's say I get over to the UK. I've got a job. It's paying me actually more than I would get paid in the United States. Mm-hmm. But I'm not planning on staying in the UK. So does the experience that I gain over in the UK and does the continuing education that I get, will that translate back to the United States? In other words, am I essentially putting my social work career on hold by going overseas?
Not at all. If anything, it's going to help better your career. If you're over in, say, the UK or Australia or New Zealand for a year or 2 years and picking up international experience, when you come back to North America, that international experience, believe it or not, is very, very highly regarded because you've got exposure to different cases and different theories and methodologies from another country that you can bring back to North America, and you can transfer that knowledge into another workplace. But it is very highly regarded. No, you're not putting your social work career on hold. If anything, it's just going to improve it.
And I guess there's a corollary. I'm being a little ethnocentric. I'm thinking about how, my social work education or my social work experience might suffer by going overseas. But I guess the other question is, do social service agencies in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, do they value the education that social workers in the United States get?
Absolutely. In the UK, from a UK standpoint, the US social care system is very highly regarded. It's one of the, if not the biggest social care system in the world. Being from a superpower like the US and having major metropolitan areas in the US very similar to the UK, U.S. experience is very, very highly regarded and sought after by UK employers.
Okay, so my skills are valued. I know the process for going over there. I've got a job. I'm going to make more money. But, let's say I'm in a relationship. Can I take my family? If I have kids, can I take pets? Are there any restrictions on that end?
Well, let's take that in two part. One being a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend or a significant other that you'd like to bring with you. Once you've secured a visa or work permit, there is a possibility of that person being on your work permit as a dependent, that they can come over to the UK with you as a dependent. Some people option to have their spouse or their significant other to secure their own work visa or work permit for their job, to get a job over in the UK. So again, there's a variety of options available to significant others. With regards to pets, believe it or not, there's actually, again, for the UK, there's a pet visa, as we like to call it. It's called the Pet Travel Scheme, and there are obviously requirements and hoops that the pet owner has to jump through. For example, getting a blood test done on the animal, having them not necessarily in quarantine for 6 months, but under supervision for 6 months before the animal is brought over to the UK. But it is a very simple procedure and pretty easy to do. It just requires the animal to be watched and tested on a regular basis before going over to the UK.
So let's say I'm dating somebody who's, or I'm in a relationship with somebody who's a nurse or a doctor or provides some other services. Is it possible that both of us could get jobs overseas? Absolutely.
I really can't speak to industries outside of healthcare and social care. For example, carpentry or IT or finance. But there is a lot of job opportunity overseas in countries. The job market's starting to come back around, in the majority of countries, especially in healthcare. I mean, no matter what, in healthcare and social care, there's always going to be a need as long as there are people around with issues. So if your spouse or your significant other is a nurse or a doctor in some sort of healthcare or social care field, then we can definitely help them find something, because not only do we need social care workers, we also do nurses and physicians as well.
Can you talk a little bit about placement agencies like the one you work for?
Sure.
What sort of services you guys provide and how somebody would get involved in that?
In the international market, in the social care field, there are a number of agencies, international agencies, that a social worker can go through, like HCL. Most agencies work in the same way, in the sense that we're recruitment firms. Our job is to get you overseas and find you an employment as soon as you get over there. In order to get involved with any agencies, typically you have to register with the agency first, which means providing them with some of your details, your name, your address, when you want to move, so that they can populate the database with your information so that we can track when you first contacted us. And then, we help you as consultants, not necessarily recruiters, but as consultants, step you through the whole process, help you work through all the paperwork, set out timelines for you and deadlines to say, okay, by this date you have to have this paperwork into me. By this date you should have applied for your visa. And by this date you should have your flight arranged. So that a lot of the thinking and anxiety is taken out of the whole process by us. So services like HCL or any other recruitment agency, it's very, very helpful in, really taking a load off of the social worker's back and figuring everything out.
It sounds like really takes the guesswork out of how to get overseas.
Yes.
And which is kind of nice because, obviously you've done this before and you know some of the hoops. And I know that in my social work program, we learn nothing about how one might get overseas. So that sounds like it's a great service. And thinking of the people that you've worked with, do you have any sort of success stories or, illustrations of the kinds of people that you've helped place and what their experience has been overseas?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the process itself is not as daunting as some people may think. You nailed it right on the head in saying that we take the guesswork and the anxiety out of the whole process. But for example, I have in October, November, a person called me. She was based out of South Carolina. She was a social worker with an MSW, had graduated about 2 years ago and had been working with the local family services agency in South Carolina. She had been thinking about, going over to the UK for quite some time. For most people, the thought about going overseas or working internationally usually is brought up during their education. They hear little tidbits about, working overseas and trying out different cases. So this individual contacted me directly after seeing, something on the web. I think it was through a forum or a chat that we had been on, and expressed her interest in going overseas. She had done very little research with regards to what's required. So it was my job as her consultant to really explain to her what the process was and lay it out for her straight. I had actually set out a timeline for her to say, you have to have this information into me by this date, so that, from the beginning till the end, we knew exactly how long it was going to take for her to get over to the UK and get employment. So we stepped through all the hoops, as you mentioned. She filled out all of her application forms. She got her registration into the local governing body. And then about a month and a half before she was going to go over, I advised her to apply for her visa. We talked about visas, and she chose which one she wanted to go with. She applied for her visa, and the process was actually, it was very strategic and very simple for her to understand. She didn't have to worry about timelines and deadlines. She could focus still on her work and what she was doing in South Carolina while she was going through all of this. We finally got a landing date set up, so she had booked her flight. And about a month before she booked her flight, we had all of her paperwork done and ready to go. She was registered. And so with that, we actually started approaching employers. So essentially what we do is, once we have your paperwork in place, we will kind of shop, if you will, or go out and be proactive and talk to the employers in the region of your choice. So this young lady decided that she wanted to work in the south of England. So we approached employers in Brighton Hove, as well as other areas along the coast in the West Sussex and East Sussex and Kent, and said, okay, this young lady, she has been registered, she's got a visa, and she's ready to come over. She's going to be landing on this date. Would you be interested in speaking with her? So a number of the employers were very interested. We managed to set up some phone interviews and Skype interviews with this person, with the employers. And through that, we had arranged some interviews so that as soon as she landed, the day after she landed in the UK, she went for her second interview with a couple of the employers. And then within a week, she had actually been offered a job. And that was just at the beginning of January. So she's been working at this employer for about 3 weeks now. She's very happy. We're staying in touch with her. She's actually attended a couple of our social events that we put together for internationals, where they can get together and talk to other Americans and Canadians and Europeans that are working in the UK, and they can kind of build a network of friends and contacts while they're over there. So it was a very successful story, went very, very smoothly. The timing was just set out right. And that's where our specialty is really, kind of setting out the timeline and having us worry about making sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed before anything happens.
It's almost backwards from what I would imagine. I would almost imagine that you would want to get the job first and then do the paperwork. But now that you've mentioned it, well, of course you wouldn't want to approach an employer until you could say, yes, this person can actually work for you.
That's right. It's essential that all of your paperwork and your visas are in place before we actually go and talk to employers. Now, throughout the whole process, we don't actually do the paperwork for you. So we cannot apply for a social worker's visa. The social worker themselves have to actually apply for the visa. We can help. We can consult with them on how to fill out paperwork, answer any questions that they may have. But the majority, of the paperwork is actually done by the social worker. We're just there to answer any questions that they may have. But in the end, we'll have a nice file on them with the completed registrations and visas, be able to go to an employer confidently and say, okay, in the case of this young lady, we were able to say, okay, she has an MSW, she's got her visa, she's got a couple of great years of work experience in the children and family services industry. Are you interested? And the employers just jumped. It was very again very smooth. They were very interested in just the way that we present information on social workers. The employers really appreciated that the social worker has gone through all of these steps in order to work overseas, and they recognize that. As far as work experience is concerned, one of the common questions that come up is practicum or volunteer experience considered by employers overseas? And the answer is absolutely yes. You may only have 6 months of real world work experience, but for the majority of universities in North America, you're required to do anywhere from about 800 to 900 practicum hours, which is about a year to a year and a half of work experience. So that again is very highly regarded by employers in the UK, as well as any sort of volunteer experience. So if there's any advice that I can offer social workers that are kind of coming fresh out of school is, get some volunteer experience under your belt, do your practicums, and, stick with your discipline. One of the biggest issues that we have is social workers jumping from discipline to discipline, so going from mental health to, say, children and families to elderly. From the get-go, choose what you want to be in and stick with it right through.
So, David, you just mentioned that social workers are interested in going overseas. It would be really important for them to stick with their major area, children and families, gerontology, adult mental health, things like that. But if I really wanted to go overseas and I wanted to be strategic about this, I guess the question is, where's the most need?
Well, there's a need in all areas at this time, but the majority of the need lies in the children and family services sector. With populations growing and universities and schools not turning out enough social workers, that discipline is really in desperate need of social workers, especially over in the UK, as I mentioned. They currently estimate that about 2 in every 7 social work positions in the UK currently remains vacant, which is an absolutely staggering number, and the majority of those positions are in children and family services, which could range anywhere from basic child protection to fostering to children's mental health, dealing with children with severe disabilities like autism. But that is by far where the biggest need is in that sector.
Well, so it sounds like there's a need for social workers. You've described a way that your company can help to make the process easier for social workers to get over there. And it sounds like the skills that we have as social workers in the United States in our training and education, that it's valued overseas, and clearly what we learn overseas will help us be more marketable and better social workers over here in the United States. It sounds like a win-win situation for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of benefits for social workers to do some international work. One is gaining that international experience, as we previously discussed. It's very highly regarded when you come back to your country. The second thing is the ability to try out different cases, being on cases, and getting it's just increasing your knowledge base and broadening your view of social work. Going overseas or becoming an international social worker allows you to practice within different environments and different structures and systems, and then be able to take that knowledge back home with you. And then thirdly, and what most people actually quite enjoy, is the ability to do some traveling at the same time. That whenever we ask, why are you interested in working internationally, the 2 most common answers are gaining that international experience and doing some traveling. For an example, with something going somewhere like London, England, which is considered the gateway to Europe and only about 2 hours away from Paris, France, it's a great opportunity to go and see different parts of the world at the same time.
It's so funny that you I'm glad that you mentioned the travel part, because I wasn't even thinking about that. But of course, if I'm visiting England for the first time, I'm going to want to know that I can go travel around and explore
Absolutely.
the world.
Well, it's true. Paris is about a 2-hour train ride from London, England. You have Belgium is, I think, about 5 hours. I mean, you're within arm's reach of Italy, and a lot of the European Union nations. It's a great experience. And, again, it's going out there, experiencing different cultures, different systems, and really kind of, it's not work experience. We say it's a lifetime experience. And to be able to turn around and say, you know what, I did that, is a great accomplishment. And you get a lot of the social workers that we have dealt with, feel very proud of being able to say, I worked overseas, in this country as a social worker, and I'm all the better for it.
Well, and on that excellent up note to end this interview on, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights into how to practice social work internationally. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today on the podcast.
You are very welcome. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and I can only hope that there are some social workers out there that are willing to try it out.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.